If you're watching this, I need you to listen carefully. Don't scroll, don't laugh it off, because what I'm about to tell you is real. This isn't one of those cheap UFO stories you hear on late-night radio or see in some grainy YouTube video. My name is Ethan Rains. I'm 32 years old. I work as a field technician fixing communications equipment, and until last year, I didn't believe in anything paranormal. Ghosts, aliens, conspiracies, none of it. I was the guy who rolled his eyes when someone said they saw lights in the sky. But now I can't sleep without seeing those lights. Now I can't drive at night without checking my mirrors every 5 seconds. Because they weren't just lights. They were watching me. And one night, they hunted me down. It started on a Tuesday evening, sometime after 10 p.m. I had just finished a repair job in a small town north of Phoenix. Normally, I'd crash in a cheap motel, but I had this stupid urge to save money and sleep in my own bed. That meant a 2-hour drive through desert highways. Empty stretches of road with no gas stations. No lights, nothing but rocks, cacti, and the occasional rattlesnake crossing under your headlights. I've done that drive dozens of times, and it's usually boring. You blast some music, sip cold coffee from a gas station, and zone out. But that night, it was different. I noticed it maybe 20 minutes after leaving town. At first, it was just a glow in the sky, far behind me. I figured it was a plane or maybe even a chopper. Border Patrol uses them sometimes. But it didn't move like one. The light would blink out, then reappear closer, brighter, then fade again. I turned off the radio, rolled down the window, and leaned to watch the sky. The desert air was cold, silent. My old pickup rattled on the cracked asphalt, but aside from that, it was just me and the stars. And that light. At some point, I realized it wasn't behind me anymore. It was above me, high but not too high, kept pace with my truck, like it was tracking me. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the longer I drove, the more obvious it became. Every time I slowed down, the light slowed too. Every time I sped up, it surged ahead, then hovered. That's when my stomach turned to ice. Planes don't do that. Helicopters can't stay silent. And satellites sure as hell don't follow pickup trucks down empty highways. I told myself to stop being paranoid, to just keep driving. But then the engine sputtered. Out of nowhere, the RPMs dropped, the headlights flickered, and my radio went dead. I smacked the steering wheel, cursed, and pulled over. I popped the hood and climbed out. The desert stretched in all directions, black and endless, the kind of darkness that swallows you whole. I shone my phone's flashlight into the engine bay, but before I could even check the wires, I felt it. That buzzing pressure in the air. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration, deep in my chest, like standing near giant speakers. My phone's light blinked, then cut out completely. And then I saw it. Hovering just beyond the road, maybe 50 feet up, was a craft. Not a disc, not the cliché flying saucer. This thing was angular, sharp-edged, like some kind of black pyramid flipped upside down. Its surface seemed to shimmer, bending the stars around it. Along the edges, faint blue lines pulsed like veins of light. It didn't make a sound, but I swear I could feel it humming inside my bones. I froze. My brain screamed at me to run, to dive back into the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch as a beam of pale light flickered underneath the craft, scanning across the ground like a spotlight. When it touched the asphalt, the surface seemed to ripple, like heat waves. And then the beam slid toward me. They kept me awake with light. At first it felt like I was dreaming, the kind of lucid dream where you know something impossible is happening but your body refuses to cooperate. The beam touched the edge of my tire and turned into a thin column of pale, almost white-blue light that climbed toward me like a hand. I remember thinking absurd things in that moment. Stupid practical things like, don't drop your phone, and breathe slowly so you don't pass out. Because my brain was trying to anchor itself in everyday logic. The light washed across my shirt, and for a second it felt like static electricity crawling under my skin. Then everything went quiet in a way that wasn't quiet. There were no crickets, no distant engines, just a heavy absence of sound that made my own breathing thunder in my ears. The beam wrapped around me like a funnel and lifted. I was still standing with the hood open, my hands greasy and useless, and the next instant my boots weren't touching asphalt. It wasn't a sudden yank like in movies. It was patient and clinical, a slow, elevator-like lift that took the breath out of me and left me floating with my arms pinned to my sides. I had time to think, in that suspended second, that it must be a hallucination, carbon monoxide from the engine, some kind of mass hysteria. But then the pickup shrank beneath me, the desert falling away, and the craft's underside filled my vision. Geometric panels seemed so fine they were invisible, and that pulsing blue that moved like capillaries under skin. I remember the smell. No smell at all, like the air had been vacuumed clean. They set me down on a surface that felt like nothing I had ever stepped on. Cold, slightly springy, like rubber stretched over foam. My legs bent without permission. I wanted to fall to my knees and scream and run and laugh at whatever part of my brain could still insist this was impossible. But a gentle pressure against the back of my head and neck nudged me forward until I was staring at a corridor. It was longer than it should have been. An optical trick, I think, because every step I took didn't seem to shorten it. The walls were the color of old bone, and faint lines of light traced themselves along the seams like circuit diagrams. I walked because I had to, because there was no other option. I remember thinking about the people I loved and hated and those I had never called back. I remember the embarrassing cabin pressure clarity of realizing how much of my life was petty and wasted. The corridor opened into a room that felt like a hospital bay had been redesigned by a minimalist. There were no chairs. There were no visible instruments. Only a central platform that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my molars. On the platform, a shape lay under a translucent sheet. No, it wasn't a sheet. It was a membrane that rippled as if breathing. For a second I thought it was a person, another human, maybe kidnapped like me, but the ripples refracted the light and formed patterns that my brain couldn't map to anything living I'd ever seen. Then I heard them. Not a voice, but a layered hum that translated into a tone inside my head more than into my ears. It wasn't language at first, more like color and temperature and the sensation of a hand on the small of your back. And then a thought slid neatly, intimately, into the back of my mind. We mean you no harm. I wanted to tell you not to be afraid. I don't know why I believed it. Maybe because the tone fit with the clinical calm of the place, or maybe because at that point my neurons were desperate for patterns and stories that made sense. That thought voice was accompanied by an image of my sister, Anna, smiling through a cracked phone screen at a birthday I had missed. I said, out loud and stupidly, "Who are you?" My question hung there like cigarette smoke. The reply was a wash of information that didn't come as words. Landscapes, stars moving, the idea of travel measured not in miles but in time and pressure and the crossing of thresholds. They weren't one thing, they were a colony, a ship, a mind linked across distance. They were curious. They were hungry for data. We observe, the tone conveyed. And with that, the membrane lifted like a curtain and whatever lay beneath it unfurled. It wasn't horrific, not in the sense of fangs and blood, but it was other. For limbs, but jointed in ways my brain kept reassigning. Elbows bending backward, wrists that seemed to twist with more degrees of freedom than my own. No eyes in the place I expected them, but slits and facets that reflected the overhead light in a way that made them appear to be looking through me. When one stepped forward, it moved like liquid metal made conscious. Precise, economical, without wasted motion. A thin, almost translucent instrument extended from one of its arms. A probe? A scanner? And trained on my forehead. My thoughts flooded. Panic? A childish prayer. The feeling of a carpenter's nail scraping under a fingernail. But the probe didn't touch. It sang. A music under my teeth that resolved into images and heat maps of my body. Like an X-ray translated into color. I felt naked in a way I never had. Privacy, all at once, was something they could fold open like paper. They didn't hurt me. They were methodical, curious. One of them, or one of that linked mind, made contact differently. I didn't feel a voice so much as the settling of attention, like someone leaning forward and reading from the margins of a book. The content wasn't words but impressions. Fear, hunger, hunger tempered by rules. They study. They do not take more than necessary. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them that necessary is a word humans use to justify terrible things, that necessity has a moral framework we don't impose on others. But that was my mind. Their mind, if it even could be called a single mind, had no such categories. What they took from me in those hours, it's the part that makes me wake at night with my mouth tasting of metal. They didn't take organs, not in the way a monster does. They took the quiet data of the human experience. Memories, raw and unorganized. They touched the image of my father's hands, teaching me to solder a circuit board, and extracted the pattern until the warmth went out of it. They replayed my first kiss like a badly encoded video, watching the edges for noise. When they reached for the memories of the night my ex left, they paused, and I felt, through whatever polite conduit they used, an echo of something like pity. I don't know if they recognized what pity is, or if they simply cataloged the emotional valence as anomalous. They were efficient. They labeled, they stored. They stitched a fragment of my memory of the desert to an image of something that looked like cratered ice and marked it with a notation that translated in my head as comparable substrate. Time didn't move normally in that place. Hours could have been minutes and minutes could have been seconds. At some point, one of them, call it the observer because that's what it felt like, projected a scenario into my head. A loop of my life where I took different turns. It showed me what would have happened if I had taken the job and moved to Seattle, if I had married Anna's college roommate, if I had gone to the motel instead of driving home. Each scenario felt like a weight and a phantom limb. They were not just stealing memories. They were weaving them into simulations, testing permutations, cataloging possible outcomes like entries in a ledger. When at last they returned a sliver of my memory. My father's laugh, but thinner, like a recording played on cheap speakers. I clutched at it like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. They let me keep the feeling, but the edges were frayed. I don't know if they were trying to be generous or if they simply didn't find the full memory useful. Then they did something else that I didn't expect. They showed me a map. It wasn't a map with names I knew. It was a lattice of nodes connected by lines that bent in ways that made the concept of straightness laughable. On the map, a series of nodes glowed where human activity had spiked and then dimmed: cities, wars, migrations. There was one node that pulsed more than the others, Earth. And next to it, like a small corolla of annotations, a single, crisp notation that translated, in my mind, as unstable, observed variance high, potential vectors, cognitive contagion. I didn't understand the phrase then, not fully, but the implication was clear. We are being watched for reasons they could not reduce to simple curiosity. They were assessing risk. They were measuring how human minds shift and mutate in contact with other information. That should have been comforting. To be measured is to be considered. Instead, I felt absurdly like a specimen in a jar. After what could have been an hour or a year, they escorted me back along the corridor. No more violent than a librarian guiding someone out of a reading room. I expected restraints, scanners, pain. Instead, the same mind that had offered the mental photograph of my life now delivered a single clean thought. We return you. Remember, Warren. The platform depressed. The ceiling opened like petals, and light reclaimed me. I fought the urge to collapse onto the asphalt. My heart hammered, but my legs worked. The truck was exactly where I had left it, but my fingers shook when I touched the steering wheel. The engine turned over as if nothing had happened. The lights steadied, and somewhere behind me the craft rose silent and impossible into the air and became a star that blinked out. I started the truck and drove faster than I ever had, not stopping until I reached the interstate and the safety of sodium-lit exit ramps and the hum of other human engines. I told no one that night. I drove straight home, showered until my skin reddened, and lay awake until dawn counting the hours in which the sky had been a thing that could reach into me. The next morning, I went to work. I told my manager I had a migraine and needed a day. At lunch, I searched the internet and found forums where people posted grainy photos and shaky videos and the same hollow-eyed disbelief I felt. I read their testimonies the way someone reads a medical journal, looking for patterns for reproducibility. There were similarities. Power outages, missing time, dreams replaced by unbearable clarity, odd scars on the skin that looked like burn marks or insect bites. But none of them matched mine exactly. None of them had the map. Over the next week, I began to notice changes that I couldn't explain. Small things at first. A sudden aversion to the smell of hot solder. The sound of a tuning fork set me on edge. And once, while I was paying at a grocery store, a woman in front of me turned and looked directly at me and smiled, and I felt somehow exposed. Like a pane of glass between us had been removed and her eyes had taken an inventory. I told myself these were side effects, stress, PTSD, whatever the clinical term is for being in the presence of something that shakes your reality. But then there were the nights. I started seeing shapes in the sky again, not hovering but farther, at the edge of my perception. Sometimes they were dots like distant beacons. Sometimes they were shards of cloud lit wrong. When I followed them with my eyes, my phone would die, or my truck would stutter, or my neighbor's dog would howl. I began to keep a notebook. I wrote down times, coordinates, descriptions, anything that would make the world legible. The act of writing steadied me. Each entry was a small piece of proof I could hand another person. A breadcrumb trail of the night my life had been rearranged. I didn't know then that the notebook would become evidence and a curse. I didn't know that the map they showed me had a purpose that would reach into the lives of people I had never met. I only knew one thing with the clarity of a man who has had something taken and returned. Whatever they did, I could not let it be for nothing. I had to warn people. I had to tell them that there are observers and they catalog and they assess, and sometimes they return what they take and sometimes they do not. So I recorded everything, starting from the call to subscribe I gave you at the top, because if no one believes me, then at least my voice is preserved in the same place, digital and searchable, a mark in a system that might someday be read by people who need to know. But warning had a cost. Once you shout into the dark hears your voice. And I had shouted. They started showing up in the margins of my life like a slow bleed. Little things at first, then patterns so specific I could no longer chalk them up to coincidence. My emails would go missing for minutes, then reappear with a new header I hadn't typed. My watch would skip time in odd increments, 13 minutes here, 7 minutes there, and I'd find myself staring at the ceiling at 3:07 a.m. wondering what had been done in the missing stretch. Strangers would call me by a name I'd never used and then apologize as if they'd mistaken me for someone else. Once, at a gas station, a kid in a Rangers jersey handed me a crumpled business card and told me, without looking up, they like to mark the storytellers. He left before I could ask what he meant. I started meeting people who had their own versions of the same night. I found them online in buried threads with half-dead URLs and usernames like DesertGhost79 and Static Memory. The language was different, but the outlines matched. A light that followed, a silence that wasn't silence, being lifted and examined. A return with a clipped warning and a memory that felt thinner. One woman, Mara, wrote about an image they had shown her of a river folding into itself. A river that was also a road, she called it, and how afterward she couldn't listen to water without tasting iron. Another user, Paul, described being handed back his childhood fear of the dark like a souvenir and how he could no longer sleep with the lights off. I expected skepticism online, trolls and hoaxers, but there was a small core who were meticulous and careful, the kind of people who track timestamps and phone records and who cross-reference GPS pings. Mara and Paul wanted to meet. I didn't want to because meeting felt like admitting I was part of whatever network they were mapping, but I also needed to know if the map they'd shown me had been shown to anyone else. When we met, in a diner on the edge of town at noon under fluorescent lights that hummed like a badly tuned amplifier, they were normal in the way of survivors. Tired, skeptical, overcaffeinated. Mara had a scar along her jaw that looked like a seam. Paul kept rubbing his palms as if he couldn't get warm. We swapped accounts and compared notes like people trading notes from a crash site. The similarities were eerie. They had all been shown something, images, simulations, that lattice of nodes with Earth marked as unstable. Paul, who'd worked as a systems analyst before he lost his job for unexplained absences, had a printout of coordinates, times and places where lights had appeared. He'd overlaid them on a map and the pattern made my stomach drop. They formed arcs and clusters around military bases, old missile silos, and places where, historically, people had gone missing or found false memory. They're not random, Paul said, his voice low. They're looking at places that have been disturbed. Places where humans have fucked with the ground or warped the sky. Mara added, they catalog cultural transmission. They mark where ideas spread faster or where trauma echoes longer. They don't steal just bodies. They harvest patterns. The word harvest made the diner feel colder. Later that week, my landlord called to say a contractor had come by my apartment asking odd questions about my schedule. I gave him a terse no and hung up, but it was the first time something felt like a human hand reaching into the perimeter the aliens had drawn. Then came the break-ins. Not the messy, ransacked kind, but the quiet kind. Drawers nudged closed, an envelope moved an inch to the left on my kitchen table. The notebook I kept at the foot of my bed opened to a page I hadn't yet written on and annotated with tiny, precise symbols I couldn't decipher. There were no fingerprints, no footprints new to the dust. It was like someone had practiced the gesture of intrusion with surgical detachment. I wanted to call the police to have an official record, but the thought of explaining the corroded parts of my story to a dispatcher felt like exposing raw nerve. Instead, I copied the notebook, taking photos and uploading them to private drives, encrypting files with the brittle paranoia of a man who'd had his memories cataloged and altered. Encryption felt childish against whatever technology had bent my life. At 2 a.m. one morning, 2 months after the craft left me on the asphalt, I woke to the truck idling outside my window. I couldn't see who was inside, but a shape moved with a confidence that made me nauseous. I grabbed a gun from a drawer, a clumsy thing I only owned because I liked the presence of its weight, and went outside. The street lamp painted the world in thin yellow. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled. As I approached, a part of me that had been trained to think in troubleshooting steps looked at the tire treads and the dust and the way the engine had been warmed recently. The treads were new. The dust on the wheel well was windblown, not parked. When I reached the driver's side, the truck door opened and a woman stepped out. Her hair was cropped close. She had an old cavalry tattoo on her forearm. "Ethan?" she said. Her voice had a crack in it I recognized from support group meetings and late-night forums. The voice of someone who had known fear for a long time and survived it. I hadn't seen her before, but she sat across from me like someone who'd been waiting for the right time to arrive. "They took my brother," she said simply. "I think they took him to test something." She slid a faded photo across the hood. A little boy at a county fair with cotton candy stuck to his cheek. I felt like I had been cuffed around the throat. People were disappearing again, and where the craft glowed there were lines on maps like spiderwebs. The woman, her name was Isabel, told me they'd been monitoring media chatter, social networks, the noisy background of human attention. "They feed on spread," she said. "Stories, fear, patterns that replicate. They want to know which ideas catch and which die." I wanted to argue that the idea of an intelligence feeding on contagion of thought was the stuff of science fiction, but Isabel had the look of someone who'd stood in black rooms and watched the same charts. She'd lost her brother 2 towns over, a quiet kid who loved model rockets. "They took him after a school trip," she whispered. There was a projection like a little lesson about the scale of the universe. "He said he saw the river road afterwards." The image cut through me again. The river that was also a road, bending reality like a seam. I started sleeping with a flashlight and the gun under my pillow. I doubled my efforts to post, to make noise, to create a pattern that might warn others without alerting whatever watched those patterns. But my warnings had the opposite effect. A post I wrote about the lattice and the annotation cognitive contagion went viral within hours, shared, mocked, turned into memes. The more it spread, the more people emailed me with their own experiences, and the more those experiences clustered into a kind of chorus that felt like a hive. Men and women wrote from small towns and big cities. They described the same pause in the air, the same show-and-tell simulation, the same return with a warning. Some described being taken repeatedly, others once. A few wrote in languages I couldn't read. My translator spat crude English back at me, and the outline was the same. Then the adverse effects began to escalate. People who'd been in contact with the story were losing time, not just minutes but days. Jobs were missed, families frayed. One woman wrote that after being shown a simulation of a war and a harvest, she had nightmares for months, and then woke up with a clean, surgical scar on her arm she couldn't explain. Hospitals reported spikes in patients with unexplained neurological symptoms. The pattern I had been trying to expose, nodes and lines in the strange annotation, now became visible in the messy human world. Journalists sniffed it out, scientists dismissed it in polite op-eds, and conspiracy channels turned it into clickbait. I felt responsible. I had sounded the alarm, and the alarm had become a beacon. That was the moment I realized the lattice wasn't just observation. It was a kind of experiment with feedback. They were not only watching, they were watching the watchers to see what changed when people knew. And when humans know, we do what we always do: we talk. We replicate. We spread. That replication was their variable. One evening, after a presentation at a community center where Isabel and I read from the notebooks and the crowd murmured and some people wept, a man in the back asked a question that put a flat stone in my gut. "If they're harvesting patterns, what are they planting?" he asked. The room was silent because the answer was worse than any neat explanation. They were seeding possibilities, nudging minds, testing which concepts could take hold and which would wither. The idea of being a test subject in an experiment that manipulated culture and thought, not just bodies, made my scalp crawl. I started recording everything with redundancy. Phones, tape recorders, written copies locked in multiple cloud accounts. I met with researchers, an ethnographer who insisted on the word mimetic ecology, and a neurologist who refused to meet my eyes when I said what they'd shown me. They all had their theories and measurements. None could explain the lattice. None could explain the annotation cognitive contagion, marked like a diagnosis next to Earth. Then, one rain-swept night, my apartment was keyed. Not broken into, not smashed, but keyed. An implement had been dragged once along the lock, a precise surgical gesture, and the metal had a residue on it like a film of lightning. I found a single note tucked under my door. It was brief and typed, not handwritten, and it said only, "Stop spreading." The rest of the page was blank. The word "stopped" felt like a command delivered from a distance. From them or from someone trying to be helpful and failing. I kept the note because it felt like proof. I continued anyway. I had to. To stop would be to let whatever they'd taken become meaningless. To continue was to risk more people seeing their lives rent and examined and altered. The more I wrote, the more the pattern grew. And in the middle of that growth, as if to punish me for my stubbornness, the stars in the sky began to organize themselves again. Dots at first, then lines, then the impossible geometry of a lattice reflected on the streetlights. I knew then that what they had shown me as a map was not merely a diagram but a living network being tested. And I understood with a sick clarity that their next step would not be subtle. ChatGPT's Ghazal. They were already there when the first blackout happened. Dots like distant beacons sliding into formation above the highway, the lattice folding itself into a shape my mind tried and failed to name. I remember the sound of my phone dying, the way the world seemed to inhale, and the taste of copper in my mouth. By then Isabel, Mara, Paul, and a dozen others from the forums had become a ragged, stubborn crew. A patchwork of people who'd been marked and returned, researchers who refused to call it anything but a phenomenon, and a handful of locals who'd seen enough strange things that their default skepticism had been worn away. We met in an abandoned service station beneath a sky so full of light it felt like a second day. We were tired in the particular way of people who have been waiting for something to happen and know they won't sleep afterward. The neurologist who'd finally agreed to talk, Dr. Klein, had the look of a man who had given up on elegant theories and was down to brute force. They respond to structure, he said without preamble, laying out printouts. They identify and harvest replicators. Ideas, emotional valences, ritual patterns, they map the transmission of those things like a pathogen. His handwriting was neat and final. If we change the structure, if we break the replicator, we can alter the selection pressure. It was scientific MacGyvering, which is to say, a terrible plan that might just work. We had no weapons that mattered against whatever those things were, and every attempt to make a public alarm only fed their dataset. So we did the opposite of everything I expected myself to do. We weaponized confusion. Over 3 nights we built a broadcast, a deliberate, engineered piece of noise that could travel both through air and through the social channels they'd been monitoring. It was not simple memes or wild claims. It was layered, contradictory, and self-invalidating. It contained dozens of local myths fused with absurdities, audio clips that looped and broke mid-sentence, images that blurred when you tried to focus on them, and metadata scrambled into palindromes and dead links. We consulted linguists to seed syntactic traps, mathematicians to embed non-repeating sequences, and artists to craft images that resisted pattern recognition. The goal was to create a mimetic object that could reproduce only if a mind attempted to model it, and in trying, the model would collapse. In short, we built a virus for pattern-hungry minds. On the 4th night, with a generator humming in the service station and a jury-rigged transmitter operating out of Paul's trunk, we sent it out. We also leaked it, intentionally, into the channels we knew they watched: message boards, streaming sites, anonymous shares. We didn't try to explain what it was. We simply seeded it and let the web do the rest. For an hour, nothing visible happened. Traffic on the highway flowed. The sky resisted the impulse to rearrange. Then the lights started. A slow, careful approach. Not a swoop or a plunge, but the cautious mapping of the air. I remember the craft's shadow moving across my hands as I held the transmitter, and the way my skin crawled when the hum resolved into a physical pressure against my teeth. The ship hovered low, closer than before, inspecting like a surgeon deciding whether to cut. I thought, uselessly, of every time they'd shown me scenes that were almost answers. The lattice, the map, the label, cognitive contagion. Maybe they were scientists in their terms. Maybe they were caretakers. Maybe they were predators whose only method of feeding happened to look like study. The probe extended, the same delicate instrument from before, and this time it pointed at the car battery behind Paul's trunk where the transmitter sat. Pulsed. The light stuttered across the field and then, impossibly, the beam seemed to split as if the air itself resisted being read. For a long minute that could have been an hour, the craft trembled. Then something inside whatever intelligence guided it did what we had hoped but never been sure it could. It attempted to parse the noise. It swam through our construct, and in doing so, it began to replicate the very collapse we had engineered. The craft's outline blurred as if someone had thrown a sheet across it. The lights winked like a faulty bulb. We watched it stall, and then, as if veiled by a collective miscalculation, it began to withdraw. The craft's ascent was not a retreat born of pain but of confusion, of an algorithm or mind encountering a mirror that made its own reflection unrecognizable. It rose until it was a blank star and then vanished. For a few nights afterward, the sky thinned. The dots at the edges dimmed and drifted. People called and messaged and posted from the forums, saying the same thing: "I can't find the post. It folded." Hospitals logged fewer strange neurological complaints. The annotated node on the map, Earth, didn't stop glowing altogether, but its pulse lessened, like a fever breaking. That was the victory we wanted, the small, violent relief of breathing after being underwater. But victory has a price when your opponent is not human and your weapon is memory. The day after the broadcast, I woke with gaps in my head. Not the tidy, edited absences they'd carved out of me the first time. Those were surgical, but a fog. Faces blurred at the edges. A joke my father had told me on the truck, a stupid, specific line, was gone. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that tasted of nothing and realized I'd given them a thing they value and they'd paid me back with omission. Felt like thievery with velvet gloves. Isabel found me that evening and didn't need to ask if the broadcast had worked. She'd cried when the stars thinned. She cried again when she noticed I couldn't recall which side of the family the old pocketknife had come from. "They harvest and they leave," she said, voice small. "But every time they come close, we lose a piece of ourselves either way." Part of me wanted to scream that we'd saved people, maybe many people. Another, quieter part cataloged what was missing. The smell of my sister's hair when she hugged me, the exact cadence of her laugh. Those were small things in the scale of the world and enormous in the scale of a life. Weeks became months. The lattice at the sky's edge remained a threat. It had been knocked back but not eliminated. The forums quieted, not because people stopped worrying, but because the thing we'd created to stop them had a half-life. It packed an epistemic punch and then dissolved. People forgot, or their memories softened. The ones who'd been taken still carried scars, literal and not, but the acute panic diffused. The authorities sniffed around for explanations and came up with weather balloons and experimental drones. Some reporters tried to build careers on the story, but without the visible lattice and with public attention that flitted like a moth, the grand narratives couldn't hold. I kept my notebook, though the handwriting became jagged as if the pen had to catch the thought before it left. I kept the photographs of the men and women who'd met in the service station. Some of them left town to bury their old lives. Others became activists in a small, urgent way, teaching pattern resistance. How to tell stories that resist replication, how to build media that could not be easily digested by those that watched for tidy threads. The world adapted in tiny ways, as worlds do. On quiet nights, I still see lights at the horizon. Once in a while, my phone will die for 13 minutes and return with an email I don't remember composing. My hands still shake around soldering irons the way they did the first night. But on most nights, the sky is simply a scatter of unremarkable stars. I keep telling the story because forgetting felt like complicity and because there are people who have not been marked yet and might benefit from a warning. I tremble when I say the thing you want me to say, the thing that turns story into doctrine, but it is true enough for me. They observe and they test. They catalog what spreads, they respond to clarity. Create clarity and they come. Create contradiction and noise and you may find them backing away. The cost is that sometimes the noise takes parts of you you cannot reconstruct. I have lost a handful of small kindnesses, a few private jokes, the color of my father's eyes. I may never get them back. But the neighbor's kid who used to stare at the sky now sleeps with his window open and dreams of trucks and football instead of pulsing lattices. That's not nothing. If you hear this and feel the itch to post, to tag, to shout it across feeds, be deliberate. Build redundancy, yes, but also consider the pattern you create. Some of us built a weapon from the very thing that hurt us and it worked enough. But we paid with pieces of ourselves we can never fully stitch back together. I don't know if there will be another time they come close. I don't know if they'll ever be curious about us again the way we imagine predators curious. All I know is this. The sky is listening in measures we barely understand, and whatever answers we give it must be chosen with care. If this ends here on your screen, then remember the people whose names I could no longer reconstruct at the edges of my memory. Remember Isabel, who lost a brother and kept fighting. Remember Mara and Paul and the others who showed up in a dingy service station because the alternative was silence. And remember that the thing that almost took us was not merely a ship but a calculus of attention. Pay attention to that calculus and choose what you amplify. Choose, if you can, to be noisy in ways that break the pattern. Choose, if you must, to keep a few things for yourself and to tell only what you are willing to see reflected back in a brighter, hungrier light. That's my final warning and my attempt at closure. We won a battle but not the war, and the sky still keeps its ledger.